Italians happen to have perhaps the best frogman commando force unit in the Western world, with a splendid record and very, very high standards. The Italians also have a first-class special operations unit within their paratroop brigade, which is certainly capable of taking on this sort of problem. It is, of course, very difficult to do anything to a moving ship. More important, the Italians have a record in dealing with terrorism. They wouldn't negotiate when terrorists kidnapped the prime minister. They had Mr. Moro and killed him, absolutely refused to negotiate with him. And they have acted whenever action was possible. When Dozier was a hostage.
It's American General Dozier, right?
Yes, when our General Dozier was not shown this delusion in the practice that it's possible to carry out command operations without casualties.
Well, let's go back to the
necessarily
getting people killed on the ship.
If a ship stops, it can be attacked by people swimming to it, covertly, obviously. Let's say at night. Frogmen at night approach the ship, scale it, which is not easy but can be done, and then go in, attack, kill the hijackers, liberate the hostages, and so on. If the ship, and there's every reason to wait until the ship stops, but let's assume that for some reason the Italians feel compelled to attack the ship when it's underway. Let's say if the hostages, the hijackers start killing hostages, they might do that. Then they would have to do it by a helicopter approach and assault. It's very obviously risky, but the Italians, I think, are the kind of people who are likely to do it. But the Italian belief in dealing with the domestic terrorism has been that the most dangerous thing is to agonize and not to act, and to sit around saying the risks are incalculable. In fact, you have to act to establish a record of action which then deters other terrorists. And in this case, imagine, if you will, a ship underway at some decent speed, helicopter comes overhead, hijackers hear the helicopter long before the people in the helicopter can do anything to them. Then it would have to sort of make a descent on a deck which will be very hazardous, very dangerous for the people jumping off a helicopter onto a moving ship. Then there is a combat phase where anything can happen. It depends how skilled these hijackers are, how well armed they are, how positioned they are at the very moment it happens. The one thing that the record of experience shows is that hijackers always claim that they have the place wired, the building, the airplane, for explosion, and they will detonate at the moment any attempt is made to rescue. Experience has shown that these detonations don't take place. Every one of the assaults that we can remember, I don't know, Mogadishu, Entebbe, or whatever, always featured this claim that the place was wired for and that it would blow up as soon as anybody arrived. I don't think this has never happened, and it's certainly less likely to happen when they're dealing with something as big as a ship.
First of all, I want to register a protest against the preposterous assertion made by Mr. Hart that Israel is responsible for this act of criminal violence by a Palestinian faction. And I also wish to register a protest against the characterization of Arafat as a statesman pursuing moderate policies for the last 10 years. Innumerable acts of terrorism and oceans of blood have been shed and perpetrated under Arafat's leadership of the PLO. Having said that, I can go on to answer your question specifically. I think this hijacking is confirmation of the thesis that some of us were propounding during the last hijacking and the one before that, that a victory for terrorism is an incentive to further terrorism. I think we see the fruits of the weak response the last time around, that is during the TWA hijacking, and also the assault on the Marine barracks in Beirut and other such aggressions directed specifically against the United States. I don't think that the terrorists of this world have been taught the lesson that terrorism does not pay. On the contrary, I think they've been taught the lesson that it does pay.
What would teach them that lesson this time?
Well, once one of these things is in motion, of course, nothing is possible that does not risk the shedding of innocent blood. Therefore, policy has to be framed in such a way as to make it less and less likely that such things will happen again. I still believe, in this instance, as I did in the past, that terrorists should not be negotiated with, and they should certainly not be allowed to win, whether in terms of the particular demands they make or in terms of some compromise demand they're willing to settle for in the course of negotiation.
Talk to them. You mean don't bargain with them and give in to their demands. Is that what you mean?
I think they have to be threatened with dire consequences. And when you negotiate with them, you concede, in effect, the legitimacy of terrorism as a political weapon or a political technique. And you, whether you like it or not, allow them into the realm of normal political discourse and bargaining, which is exactly what they want, and which is exactly what they should not get, not only because they are pursuing objectives with which you disagree, but because they are using criminal means that the entire international community ought to be united in declaring.
So you would treat
what their motives may be is a question that can be discussed in other contexts. But what we have to understand is that a crime has been committed, an act of aggression has been perpetrated, and the responsible parties are those who are committing the crime, the terrorists. And the effort to shift that responsibility to other parties is morally irresponsible and an incentive, encouragement, and reward to terrorism.
Mr. Levin.
The problem with the United States, both in the Iranian situation and the TWA hostage crisis, was not that we threatened, but that we never made good on the threats. They were seen to be empty. In the aftermath of the TWA hijacking, we haven't even resorted to the kind of legal means that we said we would adopt in extraditing the terrorists. We know who they are, and we've done nothing about that for other reasons. We have, in effect, done nothing. The terrorists have gone scot-free, and I believe that terrorists all over the world now understand that the probability of any action being taken against them is very, very slight. And therefore, they have very little to lose in staging operations of this kind. You have the Palestinian faction, which may or may not be under the control of Arafat. I'm not convinced on that point yet. Attacking an Italian ship, when, as we've already heard, the Italians have been, if anything, solicitous to a fault. So far as the Palestinian cause is concerned. It reminds me a little bit of radical attacks on the most liberal universities in the 1960s. Here you have a case of a friendly nation being aggressed against, which I think simply refutes the notion that the terrorism is caused by frustration against the resistance or hostility.
Well, let's widen this out.
Representative, you'd like that. Mr. Podhoretz?
Well, I'm glad to hear that I misunderstood, but I think if you read a transcript of these remarks Mr. Hart made, you would see that he did in fact blame Israel.
The actual point that I heard made was that Arafat is innocent and that he continues to be blamed for these things. On that point, without entering into the whole politics of it, I noticed that all these so-called tiny splinter groups that represent nobody seem to have lots of money. They have equipment, they have means, they have documents which are very hard to get. And I believe the pattern here is that there is a PLO as a kind of combined corporation which issues false passports or authentic passports from friendly countries, provides money, provides equipment, provides training. And then these operations go, sometimes coordinated, sometimes not. If I remember in the recent news reports, Arafat claimed credit for a number of terrorist acts within Israel just in the last few weeks. He then sometimes chooses not to take credit, and depends on the outcome. Sometimes we hear brand new, never before heard of organizations are suddenly presented to us. Remember Black September came into being at one point. It later turned out that Black September was a cover name for Arafat's intelligence section or some other part of the outfit. So I really think that the whole issue of the responsibility or otherwise of an individual is not important. And what we're dealing with here is a professional organization which has many different groups, some poorly coordinated, which engage in violence. And the only question is, do you say, because you have a gun, I'm going to talk to you and I'm going to make concessions to you? Or do you say these are people that have to be rubbed off to face the earth?
Can I... Retaliation against responsible parties for acts of terrorism, which is the only method by which terrorism can be effectively answered. This notion that Judaism was discredited, again, I have to protest. This is an offensive thing to say by Israel's incursion or invasion of Lebanon. The fact is that the hot pursuit of terrorism is not only legal, but I believe to be morally necessary.
What does it achieve? What have you achieved so far?
What it achieves is the fulfillment of a sense of justice in the punishment of criminal acts. That's to begin with. It also
because if I may introduce a technical note here, the Italian approach to terrorism, in fact, has been to completely disregard what the purported motives of the various terrorists have had to deal with are, and to treat it purely as a criminal act. Secondly, the Italian approach has been based on the recognition that there are no clean military operations, that there will be problems, there will be mistakes, there'll be a mess, people will get killed. And instead, they have felt that as a matter of self-respect, not cost-effectiveness, not calculating what's best for me in a short run, but through national self-respect, to deal with her. Indeed, as the British have dealt with the IRA. What has availed to the British? The fact that they have resisted the IRA for some 60 years. But I believe successive British governments, while perhaps ready to tell other countries to negotiate with their own terrorists, have themselves treated this as a matter of self-respect. So have the Italians. And I believe that they're going to use force and they're going to manifest a sovereign indifference as to the purported motives, because they have learned domestically that when a man has a gun in his hand, that does not give him the right for political dialogue.
Does that give you trouble, Mr. Levin?
Well, it gives me trouble if that's absolutely inflexible.
Absolutely inflexible.
Well, then it
Even when the Prime Minister, terrorist sees the Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro, the Italian government flatly refused to communicate with them or to respond to terrorist communications. The only thing they promised the terrorists is that they will be caught, and if not killed on the spot, would then spend the rest of their existence on this earth in prison. That was the only communication they were willing to make. And I believe they will act the same way with these people.
Well, that's like saying until you bring the millennium, you won't wipe out evil. There are always root causes for every act of violence, whether domestic or international. But one has to deal with criminal behavior as one finds it, and one cannot wait upon the solution of ultimate questions.
Certainly, the history is that Mr. Arafat and the PLO deny their participation in these activities, but in fact, it turns out very frequently that they are behind it. The Black September, the group that murdered the Israeli athletes in Munich, the group that killed 3 Israeli private citizens in Cyprus only a few days ago. In the end, they turn out to be working for the PLO. Now, we have no idea about this particular group, but the real issue, I think, is the one that Ben identified. So long as the leadership of the Palestinian people, the self-proclaimed leaders of the Palestinian people, I might add, continue to insist that they will not live in peace with Israel, that they have no intention of admitting Israel's right to exist, and as long as they continue waffling around and confusing terrorism with serious political problems, this kind of thing is going to be encouraged, and it's going to continue.
NBC News has been told by administration officials that an American commando team on the ground in Egypt had been given the green light yesterday to attack the Palestinian gunmen aboard the Achille, Lauro and to rescue the hostages. The president, without giving details, confirmed that the United States had been poised to act yesterday.
But in this last situation, we had moved, we were ready and prepared.
The commando team was waiting for nightfall to begin the attack on the Achille Lauro. But a few hours before darkness, the 4 terrorists surrendered, or in the words of one embittered Pentagon official, they were allowed to escape. The American rescue plan took shape when the captured cruise ship left Syrian waters early yesterday and headed back to Egypt. 2 Italian commando units, one on the island of Cyprus, the other shadowing the Achille Lauro on a warship, were out of position to strike by nightfall. The American units, elements of the top-secret Delta Force and a Navy SEAL team, were flown to Egypt early Tuesday aboard large transports like this one. There, in cooperation with the Italians and others, the assault was planned. The counter-terrorist unit is specially trained to retake a cruise ship from the air or by sea. Defense officials were clearly disappointed today that they had been denied this chance to strike back.
And despite Yasser Arafat's denials, Israel said today that it has proof the PLO leader knew of the hijackers' plans to sail into an Israeli port of Ashdod on the ship and conduct a terrorist operation there. Said the proof was absolute, concrete, and irrefutable. Prime Minister Shimon Peres had a warning. We will neither forget this or stand idly by, he said.
To say that the Reagan administration is outraged at Egypt's behavior is an understatement. U.S. officials point out for a government that gets more than $2 billion a year in U.S. aid, Washington has a right to expect straight answers.
Sources tell CBS News U.S. intelligence picked up independent evidence that the hijackers had killed 1 American. As a result, the Reagan administration did not believe claims by the captain of the Achille Lauro that no one had been harmed. But the intelligence apparently was not shared with Egyptian President Mubarak before he negotiated an end to the hijacking. Pentagon sources say that by daybreak Wednesday, a rescue team had flown from the U.S. to the island of Sicily. By then, the U.S. destroyer Scott was shadowing the Achille Lauro, and the aircraft carrier Saratoga had been diverted from a NATO exercise and was steaming toward the cruise liner. A U-2 spy plane, Navy patrol planes, and Air Force reconnaissance craft kept the ship under continuous surveillance in preparation for the rescue attempt.
However, Pentagon officials acknowledged that preparations were not completed until nearly 24 hours after U.S. intelligence first picked up evidence that an American had been murdered.
The man who did the operation is a fellow called Abu Abbas.
We don't know that, Arnaud. With respect, we don't know which of the 2
days that Abu Abbas did this operation. Arafat is in the ideal position of doing what he did with Black September when Abu Hassan was running it. You may remember the Munich massacre.
I've written a book about that, which has a chapter about it.
And we were all saying in the media that Black September had absolutely nothing to do with the PLO, and the PLO kept disowning Black September. They were working hand in glove, and Abu Hassan, the head of Black September, as a matter of fact, was Mr. Arafat's almost adopted son.
Now listen, the Israelis desperately interested to develop and maintain good relations with the European countries. He's got a very special good relationship with the Italians. There is no way that Arafat would be foolish enough to risk his relationship
He's not
with
risking anything at all, since he's using a cutout called the Palestine Liberation Front.
You're alleging that he's using a cutout. I'm saying that
Group 17.
You neither have got any proof either.
Those 3 vessels that sailed from Algeria to attack Israel, which were intercepted by the Israeli Navy.
How do we know they were going to attack Israel? How do we know they were going to attack Israel?
Because people have been captured and have talked.
How do we know that? Where's the evidence?
We know that Group 17 exists.
The Israelis are saying, we have this evidence. I will not believe it until they present it. And I ask you, why do they not present it?
I've interviewed Arafat for the last, I guess, 15 years, as you have. The man is a pathological liar. You know very well that anything that advances his cause is the truth. Anything that retards his cause is an untruth.
There's no way my reason can deal with that kind of bigotry. I mean, that's the most foolish thing.
Not bigotry. I've dealt with him. As you go ahead, Congressman Roberts. Excuse me, Alan Hart. Are you familiar with the thousands of documents captured by the Israelis in South Lebanon in 1982? Which demonstrated, it seems to me, he's familiar with it, the proof that you need about all the terrorist training that has gone on, not just with the Arab nations, but with 20 non-Arab nations, and the sort of better, quote, better, unquote, elements were sent on to East Bloc countries for advanced training.
This was not invented. These thousands of documents have been available for scholars to study.
Can I tell you something more? Oh, that proves that at all. It proves that Arafat is, it suggests that Arafat is going to put them on trial. He was interviewed yesterday extensively by the American networks. He was asked, are you willing to put these people on trial? And he said yes, and to bring them to justice.
And you believe him, Alan?
But how can he put somebody on trial? There are no legal precedents for him to have a Supreme Court.
I am prepared to believe that the man might not be a congenital liar.
In front of the firing squad.
The Israelis are liars, and Arafat tells you the truth. He's lied to me over and over again in countless interviews. The man is a pathological liar, as Gaddafi is.
And you know this. I can't argue against that kind of bigotry, really.
It's not bigotry. I'm sorry. I've dealt with them for most of my life.
You would still have, pardon me, Mr. Congressman, you would still have, living on the West Bank, millions of Palestinians who have occupied that
Palestinians on the West Bank.
You know who they're being conditioned by their leaders.
You would still have, pardon me, you would still have millions of Palestinians who swear by Yasser Arafat, owe him their allegiance, and consider him their leader.
You know, I learned a long time ago.
What are you going to do with those people?
Let me draw you an analogy. When you have a riot or a mob, you know what you're taught and law enforcement do? Go get the ringleader out of that mob and incarcerate him, and your mob dispersed. First of all, they ought not to be on the West Bank.
Why not?
Because it is a threat to the internal security of Israel. And once again,
they've been living there.
Your country, let me tell you something.
Wait a minute, they've been living there for
You know what? You know how they got there? Your country denied immigration to the Jewish people. You sold land to the Arabs, but you wouldn't sell it to the Israelis. You got a country that'll sit down and negotiate with PLO, but you won't negotiate with the IRA. What's the matter? Do you have a dual standard?
Says credit must offer.
On the other hand, the United States government will not punish terrorism, will not retaliate, will not engage in preventive action, will not pursue them individually, will not go after the organizations. So between the tremendous activism of the American media and the tremendous passivity of the American government, the American citizen becomes the most attractive target.
Well, it is, Mr. Lang.
How about considering what the Italian government was going to do? It was perfectly clear from the start of this episode. The Italian defense minister, Spadolini, declares publicly there will be no negotiations, no communications with the hijackers. Second, he sends cruiser of the Italian Navy after the ship, reconnaissance aircraft overhead to track it, sends his airborne commander unit, the Como Skin, in readiness to attack the ship if the ship doesn't stop, activates the Frogman commando forces to attack the ship if the ship does stop. It was perfectly clear that this episode would not drag on for weeks with interviews of all the relatives and the whole drama and so on, but the Italians would use force and they would do it very quickly.
All right, so you know, you've had murders from time immemorial, but you don't stop the action of the police, and if you wouldn't have police action, you'd have many more murders. In fact, this action wasn't related to our action against the PLO headquarters in Tunisia because it was planned well in advance. Anybody who's familiar with the logistics of pulling off something like this knows that this was been in the weeks, if not in months, in the making. But I think the issue here is, how do you stop this? Well, how do you stop it? The first thing you have to do is be very clear about those who made it, that they will be prosecuted and they will be punished. Well, now, the PLO, it seems to me, which has been behind this very clearly. This is a put-up job. You commit this crime with one arm and you deny it with the others. You even take credit, as Arafat is trying to do, for calling off his own henchmen. You have to make it clear then that they will have to pay a price.
Let me ask you, and Milton, I'm sure, can tell us, but let us first understand one thing. There is no such thing as the use of force without innocent people getting killed, unless you're talking about air combat over Antarctica, perhaps. So, whether it is in breaking up an episode, like in this case would be in attacking the ship to liberate the hostages, or in pursuing countries that are sheltering terrorist organizations, or anything else, there will always be innocent lives killed. Now, the Italian attitude to terrorism, which was the attitude that one could see emerging and getting ready to act in this case, has been that force must be used. It must be used early to break up these episodes.
Yes, innocent people will get killed, but in the long run, that is the best way to prevent further accidents, further episodes in which further innocent people will get killed.
Our action is not just one incident. We've had hijackings, piracy, killings, assassinations. This is aimed at Americans. It's aimed at the countries of the free world. And we have to do something to strike back at the terrorists and the countries that support them. We also have to make it clear that countries who do not support them cannot take a neutral position. They're either with the terrorists or they're against them.
And outraged at this brutal killing of an innocent American, the second such terrorist murder in 3 months. We're particularly distressed that there has been no announcement yet that those responsible will be turned over to the appropriate authority for prosecution and punishment.
Leon, some 6 years ago, had a stroke and was confined to a wheelchair. And therefore, he didn't walk very well. And when the other Americans and this whole group, as we said, had been put on the deck, it was impossible for Leon to walk up those stairs and so forth, and he was left behind.
Here they murdered a elderly, crippled gentleman. It is a pathetic commentary on the people who do these kinds of things.
Then, at another instant, if somebody wanted a cup, they would go and wash it out and hand it to you. They'd give you a cigarette. And then when Mrs. Klinghoffer was on the floor, exhausted, one took the butt of his gun and hit her to get her up off the floor. It was unnecessary. She would have gotten up. She was just exhausted.
We started to make some negotiations when we understood that there was no body killed on board of the ship. Why didn't the captain tell us that there is somebody killed? Would have changed our mind in the whole process.
They had made a deal that they would go free on the assumption that nobody had been harmed. Subsequently, we were told by that once they understood that there had been murder, they were in custody and would remain in custody and would be held for trial.
You're probably aware that these four have now flown out of Egypt.
No.
How do you feel about it?
Where were they flown to?
We don't know.
They've been flown out of Egypt. We think it stinks.
You think they've gone free?
I think they're going free, exactly.
Well, we think it stinks.
Who is behind the incident involving the Italian ship, Chairman Arafat?
I don't know exactly. But as you know, that the PLO is completely against this kind of terrorism. And we are condemning all kinds of terrorism against civilians.
They didn't seem to get along too well. One would tell us, one would isolate us. Another one would bring us back. One would be as nasty as could be, and they keep coming in with little propaganda, like, Reagan, no good. Arafat, good. All of this kind of talk. And they would constantly they made sure that we were fed, because they made you understand that we were supposed to report that these are very fine fellows. However, they did some very cruel things.
Names and kick rear end. It's time to rename your State Department the Capitulation Department. Get off of your stick, Mr. President. The American people are sick and tired of being kicked around. It's on your back now. You talk tough. Let's see you use some of these billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons that you've asked us to approve. Your words are cheap talk.
Everybody that was left on the ship had to come back into the dining room. And that's where they started to threaten us and show their power. They had these hand grenades in their hands. They removed the pin. They played with it. They constantly had their gun ready for shooting. And this is where they started the whole tactic.
Arafat says that he'll punish them. Is that good enough for you?
Well, I would think that if he believes that their organization has enough of a kind of national or setup like a nation that they can bring them to justice and carry that out, all right. I shouldn't have made a statement of that kind. I think that I was thinking kind of as mad as I am, vengeance instead of justice.
They had a death list drawn up, apparently, which Leon Klinghoffer was number 1. Mildred Hodes was number 2. This is what the captain said. Then there was another person, I don't remember his name, and the fourth name was Sylvia Sherman, who was in our group. So they did have a list, and they did it by taking the passports and apparently shuffling them in the order they came out. That was the death list.
Port Said, the U.S. ambassador to Egypt, Nicholas Veliotos, arrives at the dock to go out to the Achille Lauro for a personal inspection. Although Egyptian authorities have said all passengers are safe, Washington does not believe it. On board the ship, Veliotos learns the truth and reports by radiophone to U.S. officials on shore. The conversation is recorded in New York by Independent Network News.
Leon Klinghoffer is dead. He was murdered by the terrorists off Tartus. The terrorists then showed the captain the passport of Mildred Hodes and said she goes next. She pleaded for her life. They said, okay, but you tell those Syrians that we've killed 2. They then kept a gun on him constantly and anyone else near the radio and threatened to kill anyone who told the truth.
The purser on the ship tells what he knows about the murder in a radio conversation with ABC's Wolf Ackner.
So you saw the dead man?
Yeah, sure, because one of the terrorists went coming in the lounge and say with the captain, I must get one. Then when he came back, he was also dirt on the trousers. And then we have never seen this passenger. Then he said that he did kill him and that threw overboard.
You mean sui pantaloni?
Correct.
Ambassador Veliotos.
In my name, I want you to call the foreign minister, tell him what we've learned, tell him the circumstances, tell him that in view of this fact and the fact that we and presumably they did not have the facts, we insist that they prosecute those sons of bitches.
At the White House, blunt statement from Press Secretary Larry Speaks.
We are saddened and outraged at this brutal killing of an innocent American, the second such terrorist murder in 3 months. We're particularly distressed that there has been no announcement yet that those responsible will be turned over to the appropriate authority for prosecution and punishment.
This blunt public criticism of Egypt could harm U.S.-Egyptian relations, but U.S. officials are prepared to take that chance. The message to Egypt about its deal with the hijackers is this: we never liked it, we advised against it, now we expect you to break it.
It's a problem we'll have to look at and find out, and if I had an answer to that specifically right now, I wouldn't make it public.
In fact, U.S. intelligence had been tracking the whereabouts of those 4 terrorists, discovered that they were being placed aboard an Egyptian Boeing 737 and that they were about to be flown out of Egypt. White House Press Secretary Larry Speaks confirmed late tonight that U.S. warships from the aircraft carrier Saratoga tracked the Egyptian plane, intercepted it over international waters, and escorted it to Italy, where the plane was forced to land at a NATO base on the island of Sicily. The plane was immediately surrounded by U.S. and Italian troops. The 4 hijackers were taken off the plane and are now in an Italian jail. Larry Speaks told reporters here in Washington moments ago that the United States government will request extradition of the hijackers.
Somewhere off the coast of Egypt.
The Saratoga becomes one of many supporting elements in a proposed rescue operation. Within a day of the hijacking, secret Delta forces, shown here in a training film, are in the Mediterranean. By day 2, Delta Force is reportedly ready to strike. But the hijackers give up. No rescue is necessary. The confusion. To win release of the hostages, Egypt promises freedom for the terrorists. The U.S. strongly protests. But by yesterday morning, Egyptian President Mubarak claims the hijackers are already gone.
So where are the hijackers now?
They left the country. I don't know where.
But U.S. officials say Mubarak was lying. The escape. Under cover of darkness, Egypt plans to smuggle the terrorists out of Egyptian territory aboard a chartered civilian airliner. The U.S. activates an intelligence network, intercepting radio signals, seeking unofficial cooperation of sympathetic Egyptians. As details are pieced together back in Washington, a second American plan for military action begins taking shape. President Reagan in Chicago for a speech is pulled into a side room and presented with the plan. He gives tentative approval. 3 hours later, aboard Air Force One, 15 minutes before the Egyptian plane leaves the ground, President Reagan says, go. The intercept. From extremely good intelligence, the U.S. knows when the Egyptian Air 737 will take off, where it plans to go, what route it will travel. 2 hours before it actually takes off, the aircraft carrier Saratoga, now south of Italy, swings into the wind. Warplanes are scrambled. 7 F-14 fighters are sent to a holding pattern south of the Greek island of Crete. An E-2C early warning plane is also scrambled off the carrier, and later, with its powerful radar, begins tracking the Egyptian aircraft shortly after it leaves the runway. For hundreds of miles, the F-14s stalk their prey. Finally, off Crete, 4 F-14s close in on the target, in darkness, observing radio silence with all running lights off. They surround the civilian plane wingtip to wingtip. On the radio, the aircraft is ordered to change course and head for Sicily. Military sources say the U.S. pilots were prepared to fire warning shots, but could not go further without permission from Washington. 3 hours after taking off from Cairo, the Egyptian plane was forced down on Sicily and surrounded by Italian troops and U.S. commandos from the Delta Group. The terrorists surrendered, offering no resistance.
Flying with their lights out, inspecting commercial airliners as they went by, searching for the Egyptian 737.
It's a crowded...
First, they shadowed the 737, silently listening as it requested and was refused permission to land in Tunisia, then turned toward Athens only to be denied landing rights again. Then the F-14 surrounded the 737. The Hawkeyes ordered the Egyptian plane to follow them to Sicily or else. The planes landed at 6:45 Eastern Time, and the 737 was surrounded by American commandos who had been sent to Sicily earlier in the crisis for a possible rescue mission. U.S. officials wanted to keep the 4 terrorists, but Italy insisted on its rights. That was about the only hitch in what officials touted as a flawless administration, which intelligence was paused.
Well, the crew and the airmen on the Saratoga had very little time to prepare, for very little notice as to when they would execute. Obviously, the operation would have to be carried out at night. In order to intercept anything on the airways in the central Mediterranean, they would operate some distance from the carrier, and that meant that we would have to use all the assets, not just fighters for the interception, but tracking aircraft, as well as tankers, so that they could sustain their position on the airways. And of course, it would require considerable finesse in the actual intercept. I think they did an exceptional job, and we're proud of them.
To sort through a number of planes that were in the Mediterranean airspace, does that mean that you did not know exactly when this aircraft took off from Cairo?
We didn't have as much information as we would prefer.
But in any event, I hope that those 4 terrorists are extradited to the United States, tried, and executed upon conviction.
Executed?
Absolutely.
All 4?
Well, it's called a felony murder.
Yeah.
You don't have to pull the trigger to be the murderer if you're part of the entire crime. It's a felony murder, and there are laws as it relates to the taking of hostages that subject you to murder charges.
Mayor Koch says the heroic capture of the terrorists could only have happened with a president like Ronald Reagan.
President Reagan deserves an enormous amount of credit for the courage that he has shown in doing it. I'm not so sure that President Carter would have done it.
And if President Carter had done it, probably our planes would have broken down. Well, you know, I mean, that was, he lived under an unlucky cloud, or he himself just wasn't very competent.
I know that we all in Israel appreciate very much the courage of the decision of the President and the government of the United States to prevent the hijackers to go free, and the effectiveness of the interception that brought the four terrorists. And in accordance to our information, there might be the Abbas, the head of the group that carried out the hijacking of the ship, is also on board of the plane, and might be another representative of the PLO that served as a liaison between Mr. Arafat and this group, which is close to the Arafat PLO.
Now, this...
Well, I believe that one of the leaders, if not the leader, of the group that carried out the hijacking was sent to Egypt, and in addition to some representatives of Mr. Arafat's PLO, they served as a go-between the hijackers and the Egyptian authorities.
Your government...
Well, we believe that the group that carried out this terrorist act was linked, might be loosely, to the Mr. Arafat PLO. The fact that they decided not to go to Syria and the refusal of the Syrians to have any deal with this group of the PLO, and the agreement on the part of the Egyptian government influenced by Mr. Arafat, shows that the group was much closer, if not part, of the overall framework of Mr. Arafat's PLO. Come back to what Dr. Kissinger started. Let's not go out of focus. The problem is coping with terrorism, with terrorists. In these cases, especially in what happened in Larnaca, happened in the hijacking of Italian ship, the killing of Israeli sailors in Barcelona, shows that Mr. Arafat's PLO returned to the use of terror in indiscriminative ways. The problem is first and foremost to cope with the terrorists, with all of them, not to try to say Mr. Arafat has become moderate and therefore his terror acts are of no importance.
Well, let me stop you for a moment, if I may, Defense Minister, because what you are saying may be true. It may be, it almost certainly is what Israel would like to believe is true, but it is also possible that Arafat played from beginning to end a very benign and useful role here, and that these people were acting without his knowledge and certainly without his sanction. Won't you even concede that that's a possibility?
Not at all. When it comes to the killing in Larnaca and Barcelona, we have got facts. When it comes to the hijacking of the ship, look, this operation was prepared in months before it was carried out. And no doubt in my mind that some in the Arafat hierarchy knew about it. Therefore, let's face it, Arafat is an expert in denying any relations to what parts of his organization does. We experienced it in the past, in the Black September story in the 1970s, and no doubt it repeats itself now. Therefore, the problem, let's cope with terror. Second, let's create cooperation between governments who are ready to fight terrorism in the most effective way. This is what should be the lesson of what we have experienced now.
Precisely what up to now they have refused to do. Disavowing an individual act of terrorism in which they may or may not be involved, I don't have the facts on this, that is not in itself meaningful, because that could simply be a maneuver.
Disavowing is one thing, but the Italian foreign minister confirmed to us the other day that indeed Arafat had been extremely helpful.
The Italian position towards the PLO has always been a rather ambivalent one, and I don't know on the basis of what he made that judgment. I don't see how Arafat can claim that he has influence over these terrorists in making them surrender, but that he has no influence in getting them started.
All right.
No doubt it's a case of negligence on the part of the Italians to allow the ship to be kidnapped and hijacked. I believe the fact that the United States intercepted the Egyptian plane, brought the hijackers and I hope their leaders under the custody of the Italians, no doubt serves as an effective deterrence for the future. Hopefully that the Italians will not continue to cooperate with the PLO terrorists and others and bring about an immediate release of them.
Italian officials, in a surprise move, allowed Palestinian leader Mohammed Abu Abbas to slip out of Italy and avoid prosecution. He arrived in Yugoslavia tonight. American authorities had issued an arrest warrant for Abu Abbas, accusing him of masterminding the hijacking. Abbas had been on board the Egyptian plane with the 4 hijackers when it was stopped by U.S. fighter planes. Abu Abbas, today, after questioning, Italian officials allowed Abu Abbas to leave. Keith Miller reports.
The getaway was by no means dramatic. The Egyptian airliner took off from a military airfield for a short hop to Rome's international airport. Here, Mohammed Abu Abbas and another Palestinian got off and boarded a Yugoslav Airlines jet bound for Belgrade. The escape could not have happened without the consent of the Italian government. U.S. Ambassador Maxwell Rabb went immediately to the office of Italy's Prime Minister. "I am not happy at all," he said, "with what has happened here today." The Italians already knew of the warrant for Abbas's arrest when police sealed off the Egyptian Cultural Center in Rome. Anti-terrorist prosecutors wanted to question Abbas. He was not allowed to see him. Abbas could have left the building by van. Police made no attempt to identify the occupants. It drove directly to the waiting Egyptian plane. Abbas, a member of the PLO Executive Committee, was wanted in the United States for piracy, hostage-taking, and conspiracy to commit both crimes, all in connection with the ship hijacking. But denounced the U.S. and what he called the cowboy logic that led to the forced landing of the Egyptian airliner. But there were no harsh words for Italy.
White House spokesman today expressed anger that Abu Abbas and the other Palestinian were allowed to leave Italy. He said the Italians did not consult the U.S., even though America thought it had an understanding with the Italians.
The mysterious man known as Mohammed Abbas, who was allowed to leave Rome today by Italian authorities, was also the center of much attention in Tunis, where the Palestine Liberation Organization now has its headquarters.
American action is a violation of international law. But Arafat's main concern today was over the fate of a top aide, Abu Abbas, who helped negotiate the release of the hostages and was on the intercepted Egyptian flight. Abbas, based in Iraq, is head of a key military wing of the PLO, whose other wings are scattered across the Mideast. Israelis and Americans believe Abbas may have organized the whole Achille Lauro hijacking.
The captain appeared for the first time. He is the man on the right. The Egyptians once thought he misled them, saying there were no deaths. They now accept that statement was made with a gun to his head.
At about 2 a.m. this Sunday morning, the White House said it was incomprehensible that the Italians released and allowed to leave the country Mohammed Abbas, a leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The White House called him a notorious Palestinian terrorist who masterminded the hijacking of the cruise ship. The Italians held him in custody along with the hijackers, but allowed him to leave and to fly to Yugoslavia, where he is now. The U.S. Ambassador to Rome, Max Rabb, talked with the Italians about this. Here's ABC's Hal Walker in Rome.
After being detained for a day and a night in Rome, the intercepted Egyptian airliner was allowed to leave this morning for Cairo, setting the stage for the return to Italy of the cruise ship Achille Lauro, which had been kept by Egyptian authorities in Port Said. But relations between the Americans and Italians remain strained. U.S. Ambassador Maxwell Rabb met again today with Foreign Minister Giulio Andreotti, complaining that Italy had failed to hold Palestinian leader Mohammed Abbas, wanted by the Americans for questioning. Abbas, who left Rome for Yugoslavia yesterday, has denied involvement in the cruise ship hijacking and said today that Leon Klinghoffer, believed to have been murdered, died of a heart attack. The 4 men charged with piracy and murder on the Italian cruise ship.
We have no objection whatsoever, Mr. Brinkley, to the proposition that the Italians will judge the 4. The obligation that nations have to one another is either to prosecute or to extradite. We object to the fact that they did neither of those things and failed to fulfill their obligation with respect to the 5th, Mohammed Abbas. The treaty conferred upon them a clear duty to hold Abbas until we had been given a fair opportunity to present the evidence we had against him. We went in the middle of the night. We accumulated as much evidence as we could in 24 hours. We got a complaint, we got a warrant. We sent the papers to Italy with a summary of our evidence. We told them that more was coming, and more has been coming. More is accumulating every hour. But they did not wait. They rushed, made a decision, and let him go. Mr. So funny is that Craxi told our president that the 6 would be kept in jail. And these two, particularly Abbas, were put in the Egyptian Cultural Center. And they were sneaked out of there, as far as we understand, in Egyptian sailors' uniforms as soon as this abbreviated, shall we say, process was complete. When the White House announced that it was astonished at their treatment of the Abbas application, it is because we expected so much more based on the tradition and the cooperation we've been getting. Now, what we've done here is we have sent to Yugoslavia not only what we sent to Italy, but the transcripts and hard evidence that we have accumulated in the 24 or 48 hours since then. We sent all that out last night, and I believe we were able to get it into the Yugoslavians' hands before the plane touched down in Yugoslavia. We did the best we could to make the legal system work. And it's the failure of states to abide by their legal obligations which cause and which justify the kinds of moderate, restrained, but appropriate measures that we took.
Any response from you?
We have received a response, and I must say that we are worried. We are very concerned. We have an ongoing expectation of a meeting very soon. And this is being played out right now today, and we only hope that they will look at this and judge it according to their treaty, which confers a mandatory obligation on them, where we have gotten a warrant from a federal judge based on probable cause to hold someone long enough for us to get the formal extradition papers to them, or up to 60 days. So if they abide by their treaty, their extradition treaty, we will have ample time to prove that Abbas is guilty of this crime as one of the conspirators.
The information is that he is in Yugoslavia, that the Yugoslav authorities have declined to detain Abbas under the request we made through Interpol, so that I would anticipate that he will probably move along. I understand he's operating under an Iraqi diplomatic passport.
Do we know precisely where he is right now?
Well, I think there's reason to believe he's in the PLO embassy at Belgrade, but that information changes hourly.
Ambassador, was it incomprehensible given the context?
It's a very complex thing. Let me go through it very quickly. The first argument that Craxi used was that Abbas had a diplomatic passport from Iraq. And frankly, as an international lawyer, that doesn't wash, because you don't have immunity because you carry somebody's diplomatic passport. You have to have the agrément, the accord of the country as a part of a diplomatic mission. This man was not a diplomat accredited to Italy, so that doesn't wash. Secondly, they said it was a plane that had immunity. It was a civilian aircraft. There's particular interest in the new extradition treaty that was concluded 2 years ago between Italy and the United States. That is a troubling thing. That treaty provides that if we put out a warrant for the arrest of someone, as we did for Abbas, the Italians have an obligation to hold that person up to 45 days.
And they've been pretty good at
But
that.
until this one, and they let him go. I think they had a legal obligation to detain him until we could present our evidence, which I'm told is really overwhelming.
It is substantial.